Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Maxim Furek, author of Somebody Else's Dream.
Maxim Furek is the author of Somebody Else's Dream, Dakota, the Buoys, and Timothy. If we were to go back to the area around in northeast Pennsylvania in the 1950s as rock and roll is emerging, what kind of a vibe would we see?
Well, everything was sort of new and experimental. And when rock and roll first started to be heard around the 50s, it was something that was pretty revolutionary. I talk about in my book, Somebody Else's Dream, I talk about how Pennsylvania, although Pennsylvania wasn't the birthplace of rock and roll, although we had Bill Haley, he did Rock Around the Clock, and that was radical, that was revolutionary. And when kids heard that for the first time at the movie theaters, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to conduct themselves, and they tore out movie theater seats, and there was just a whole lot of violence and vandalism. It was something that was just new. And I talk about how even during the United Nations had a report about linking rock music to juvenile delinquency, and they talked about this horrible uprising of juvenile delinquents and drug use and perversion and violence. And there were two people, though Pennsylvania was not the birthplace of rock and roll, there were two luminaries who sort of promoted rock and roll to the world, to the masses. One of them was Dick Clark, and he was on the East Coast. He was with American Bandstand. What Dick Clark did was he had his teenagers dress up. I mean, they wore sports jackets and ties, and the girls weren't allowed to wear anything provocative. So what he did was he sort of cleaned up the image of rock and roll, and also he played a lot of sort of sugar-coated, lightweight rock. So that was more palatable to the masses. On the other side of the state, in Somerset County, was Alan Freed. Alan Freed has the distinction of being the father of rock and roll. He was the one that pretty much like trademarked or patented the term rock and roll. And he had a radio station, a program in Cleveland called Moondog's Rock and Roll House Party. But what Alan Freed did, he was the opposite of Dick Clark, and what Alan Freed does, he played what was called black music, race music, or devil's music, and it was hardcore rhythm and blues. But he helped shape and define the vocabulary of rock and roll, and both Dick Clark and Alan Freed were the trendsetters, pioneers and promoters of rock and roll to the rest of the world. So, as a Pennsylvania rock journalist, I'm just proud of what our Commonwealth represents.
So during that time period in northeast Pennsylvania, were local radio stations playing rock and roll, or did kids who wanted to listen to it had to pick up stations from outside the area?
Yeah, no, there were stations that started to pick up on it, but as you know, we evolved from country music to what was called rockabilly, which was a blend of hillbilly and rhythm and blues, and then it became strict rock and roll. But with Elvis, and he had that rockabilly sound. He was called at one time the Rockabilly Cat. And there were always stations out there where you could listen to the more progressive sounds, the R&B sounds and the rock and roll sounds. And if they weren't local, they were the larger city. So teenagers always had access to that music. And as a teenager, I remember I always listened to WKBW in Buffalo. They were just powerhouse station, and disc jockeys were sort of like the superstars of the day. I mean, they just did a whole lot of really crazy, irrelevant things, and us teenagers at the time really loved what they did and what they represented. So stations played a big part too in spreading the word of popular music.
Now, one of the figures you talk about is Joe Nardone, and he had a band called the All Stars. Who was he, and what was the band?
Yeah, Joe Nardone was one of the pioneers. I have a section of my book, Somebody Else's Dream. I have a section called The Pioneers. Joe Nardone was the one who introduced rock and roll into northeastern Pennsylvania. He had a band called the All Stars. His big hit was called Shake a Hand, and he would play at Sansui Park that had the most perfect cavern. It was the most perfect venue as far as acoustics. And he did so much. And of course, his band had that saxophone, and a lot of the early rock and roll bands included a saxophone before, the Beatles and Buddy Holly, formed another template for what a rock act should look like. But Joe Nardone certainly is one of the pioneers, and much loved. He's still playing. He's in his late 70s, and he's still playing with the All-Stars.
Did he influence kids in that time to start their own bands?
Absolutely. I mean, he was a big influence, just as the Beatles were an influence. And with the Beatles, when they first came over in 63, 64, the whole world just sort of exploded. The world was on fire. It was a cultural, sociological change. A lot of these kids wanted to be like the Beatles, and so they bought these Stratocaster guitars. They went into the garage. They learned their mandatory 2 or 3 chords, and they recorded some brilliant songs that were called garage rock, but that was definitely came from what the Beatles created. So kids wanted to go and do that same sort of thing. But what garage rock was, I mean, it was basic primal rock and roll. It was just raw. It was a couple of chords, but part of that rock and roll encyclopedia. It was just brilliant music.
So you mentioned that Joe Nardone played at Sans Souci Park. Give us a sense of what that park was like. He was the house band there, is what you talked about. So what would it have been like to have seen a concert there? There
would be thousands of kids there, paying maybe 50 cents to go and hear the band. Joe then got into promoting, and he would bring in people like Sam the Sham, Wooly Bully, and that was the largest concert ever at Sans Souci. But he brought in Neil Diamond, and Neil Diamond, I believe, was from Brooklyn. He would drive in here, and Joe Nardone actually gave Neil Diamond his break, and his break came in northeastern Pennsylvania. And when they opened up the one amphitheater in Wilkes-Barre, Neil Diamond was the opening act. He was the first person to perform there. So, he was really appreciative of what northeastern Pennsylvania did to his career.
Now, another figure you talk about who was local was a young man who was Eddie Day and the Nighttimers. Who was he?
Yeah, okay, Eddie Day. He was with TNT, and he's with the Starfires. Eddie Day is a representative, Pennsylvania House of Representative, politician, and also he's been with the band for decades. And again, Joe Nardone and Eddie Day get together, and they do an annual concert that brings out a ton of people. And you're talking about baby boomers and also members of the silent generation that preceded baby boomers, who still want to keep the memories alive. And Joe Nardone and Eddie Day are certainly doing that.
Now, one of the figures you talk about also was Michael Wright, who would, you mentioned that he was scouting Northeast Pennsylvania talent. What role did he play in developing some of the bands that would come out of this area?
Yeah. C. Michael Wright was a sound engineer for Scepter Records, and he knew that northeastern Pennsylvania was a hotbed of musical talent. He had produced some of the groups there. I think Eddie Day. I think he did produce a song for Eddie Day, but there are a number of acts that he had been working with. And he had heard about a group called the Buoys, and so he went down to Exeter to Pete's place to listen to the Buoys, and he liked them, so they signed them to a contract. What was interesting is that C. Michael Wright knew Rupert Holmes, and Rupert Holmes is a fledgling singer-songwriter. C. Michael Wright had the keys to Scepter Records, so on the weekends they would sneak into the studios and experiment with the latest technology, record their own songs, just see what they could do with the reverb and everything else. And they released a song called These Days, and what it was a song that had already been done by a group called Mode of Music. And what they did was they stripped out the vocals, and they had Bill Kelly of the Buoys just do the vocals over again, and it was their first release, and Bill did a great job. And Rupert Holmes and C. Michael Wright realized that Scepter Records was not going to give the Buoys another chance, so they had one other release. So what Rupert Holmes did was he thought he wanted to write a song that would be so controversial that it would get the Buoys notoriety. Well, he wrote the song, Timothy, but what happens was the song received that notoriety rather than the Buoys. So Timothy, which was, and my book, Somebody Else's Dream, basically started out to connect the song Timothy from 1971 with the Sheppton mine disaster of 1963. So that was just going to be a juicy type of rock mythology, and I was going to tie those two together. And what happened was, as the more I researched Sheppton, the more I realized that there were other aspects of Sheppton other than just a pop song about cannibalism.
Well, let's go back a little bit and talk about the Buoys. Who were the members of the band? When was it founded?
Yeah, Buoys were founded back around '63. Bill Kelly was the lead singer. Fran Brezina was in the band. Carl Syracuse. Bob Grisak was the bass player. Chris Hannon was the drummer. And they started to, they were practicing and rehearsing, and there was a guy named Bill Bachman who was with WBAX. And so what Bill Bachman did was, and this was sort of not unusual at the time, but he would bring the Buoys around to the different record hops that Bax Radio had. And he would introduce them as the Buoys from Bax. So they had been called the Moffats, and they changed their name to the Buoys, B-U-O-Y-S, with that nautical theme. And at that time, Jan and Dean and, a lot of the, the Beach Boys, there was that surfer, trend. So they went with the Buoys. But the Buoys started, they had really great harmonies. Bill Kelly was an excellent showman, had a great vocal range, and thanks to Bill Bachman, he took them around, and they got a lot of gigs, a lot of dances. And northeastern Pennsylvania at the time was just a hotbed. I mean, there were so many bands that were playing, as well as venues that would support them. So every weekend there would be, numerous live bands playing, and it was so much more just prolific then than the scene is now.
How old were they when they started the band?
I think Kelly might have been 13, 14. They were just young kids, but they got good fast. They got some equipment to help them, and then what they did was they started to play Beatles songs, and they would use 2- and 3-part harmonies, and that set them apart from other bands. I mean, they were good with that. So again, they followed that Beatles songbook, as did many other rock acts of the time.
Was there a point where they started writing their own music?
There was, but this was after they broke away from the Buoys. So they stayed with the Buoys for quite a while. And then Bill Kelly, and after Bob Grisak, the bass player, left, he was replaced by a guy named Jerry Ludzik. So at one point, Bill Kelly and Jerry Ludzik left the Buoys, and they wanted to write their own songs. And so they did. They became the Jerry Kelly Band, and then another incarnation was a band called Dakota, which was really interesting and successful, and deserved to have a lot more success than what they were able to get.
Another person you talk about in the book is Florence Greenberg.
Yeah.
Who is she?
Okay, Florence Greenberg. She was a large, matronly Jewish lady from New Jersey, and she was the CEO of Scepter Records. So she had Scepter Wand Records, and also HOB, House of Beauty. That was their gospel label. She mainly dealt with a lot of black artists, like the Shirelles. So the Buoys were, I think, maybe the first white rock act that they had, and they didn't really quite know what to do with them, and didn't quite know how to promote them. But when Timothy was peaking in '71, that's when Scepter was falling apart, and so what could have been, a couple more steps of success, just sort of stagnated. But Florence, she would go after talent. She knew the Shirelles because her daughter went to school with some of the Shirelles. She was sharp enough to go and pick up the contract of the Kingsmen, and Louie Louie was just such a hot song, just a controversial song. So she was able to go and have that on her Wand Records. And she was a pretty impressive business person.
What would it have been like to record at the Scepter studio?
Not real good. Scepter didn't have a high quality studio. As a matter of fact, Lou Reed, when he did his Velvet Underground LP, he did he cut some of the songs there, but then they would go and cut them elsewhere at better studios. So at the time, and all the boys told me this, the technology at Scepter was pretty primitive. There were other studios that were a lot better. But again, that Buoys album, which has been called Dinner Music, is coherent. It's acoustically, good. Certainly not perfect, but it's a nice album, with good clarity. So they did a good job on the Buoys album.
How did the recording of that album go?
Well, Rupert Holmes had, what happened was Timothy came out, and it sort of floundered, and then it started to climb. And I think the kids would listen to the song, they liked the music, but then they would listen to the lyrics and realize, wait a second, this is about something pretty grotesque, It sounds like it's about cannibalism. So the song started to become a hit, and Scepter realized that they needed an album to accompany the hit song. So they went into the studio. Rupert contributed, I think it was 5 songs. Give Up Your Guns was the Buoys' second hit. Tomorrow was one. Blood Knot. And then the Buoys did all the others. And at the time, their influences were Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Poco, Loggins and Messina, groups like that. And those are the groups that they tried to emulate. But everybody contributed to the actual production of the songs. I mean, for example, Rupert Holmes, when he sang Timothy to them for the first time, he did it sort of like a slowed down funeral dirge. But they decided they wanted to go and speed up the tempo, so they made it more like a Creedence Clearwater song. So they did that. And then nothing was happening with Timothy, so they brought in Howard Reeves, who I think was the band director for Johnny Carson. And he added strings to it, much like Elton John's 70s, things like Madman Across the Water. So that strings just embellished. Some people hated it, and other people liked it, but the strings just embellished that rock song and gave it a unique identity to go along with the grotesque lyrics of the song. So it was a fine produced song, and a lot of people contributed to it.
How did you first discover this band?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so that was 1971, and I was going to school in Shawnee, Oklahoma, Pottawatomie County, and I was going to a small Catholic school, and I heard the song Timothy, and I forget exactly my first reaction to it, but when I found out that they were from northeastern Pennsylvania, I mean, I was just like wowed. Finally, our region got a hit song, on Billboard. Finally, after all these years. So I was just amazed and impressed, and over the years, I was able to interview members of the Buoys, Jerry Kelly, Dakota, and I think I may not be unique as a writer, but you go through ups and downs. You go through periods of despondency. You second guess yourself. You have massive amounts of self-doubt. Like, am I wasting my time on this book? Will people like it? Am I being foolish? You question that. But when I did get back to it to finally complete it during the pandemic of 2020, I put it together, and it's probably my finest book. I mean, I love the book. I love the way it looks, and the way it feels, and 350 pages of lots of research, put into it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Rupert Holmes. You mentioned him before. That's not his original name.
No, before that he was called Julian Gill, and before that it was David, I believe Greenbaum or Goldstein.
Goldstein, yeah.
David Goldstein, right, okay. But I met Rupert Holmes at the 1980 Bloomsburg Fair and had a chance to interview him, and he was hitting it big with the Pina Colada song and him and Answering Machine. So it was a lot of middle of the road, maybe like adult contemporary music. So the crowd was sparse. It was on a Saturday, it was on a September in 1980 when I interviewed him, and I asked him about the genesis of Timothy. Did he know anything about the Sheppton mining disaster that many people felt Timothy was about? I asked him about the failed Polydor sessions. Asked him, about Florence Greenberg and Scepter and the amounts of records that were sold. So we talked about all that. But one thing about Rupert Holmes was he was the perfect person to interview. I mean, every quote he had was just perfect from beginning to end. Just little gems, little phrases. I mean, he was really good. And I enjoyed the interview. And then years later, we had a chance to talk. He requested an autographed copy of the book. So I spoke with him just months ago. So,
what was the Sheppton mine disaster?
Yeah, okay, that's pretty interesting. That was the 1963 Sheppton mining disaster. And in '63, just outside of Hazleton, 3 men were entombed for 2 weeks, and only 2 came out. This was international news. This was, the Associated Press called this one of the most important stories of the year, and it was surpassed only by the assassination of President Kennedy in November of '63. But Sheppton had, when I was working on somebody else's dream, I started to research Sheppton, and I found out that there were other aspects of Sheppton other than the horrible allegations of cannibalism. There were accounts of the paranormal, and there were accounts of the miraculous by Pope John the 23rd. So all of those elements, the supernatural elements, I put into my previous book, Sheppton, The Myth, Miracle, and Music. And the music, of course, being a chapter about Timothy and the Buoys and the connection to Sheppton.
Now, you say that Casey Kasem's introduction of the song was one of the significant moments. Why was that so important?
Well, he was the guy. I mean, everybody listened to Casey Kasem. And I have in my book his, the introduction to that. But, if you were into music, I mean, you would listen to Casey Kasem, you would listen to what songs were rising, peaking, debuting, going down, which songs were staying at the top of the charts for the longest time. But he was knowledgeable. He had that wonderful voice, that resonance, and he was just somebody that a lot of us listened to. He was another personality who maybe shaped, and helped to define popular music. So
why was a song purportedly about cannibalism so popular to people?
Well, good. That's a good question. Well, first of all, it was about cannibalism in a mine shaft. And Rupert Holmes has admitted that many times. It wasn't about a canary or a mule. It was about a person being cannibalized. So that was that. But why do people, flock to horror movies and things of a grotesque nature? I mean, you could ask Jung that. Carl Jung would talk about our shadow self. That maybe we go towards things like that just to go and settle down and control our shadow self, the horrible things that we think about or think we are or whatever, so that shadow self. But people like controversy. Florence Greenberg liked the controversy, and despite of what she said, the controversy helped fuel record sales, even though the song was banned on places like WABC. So controversy was good for sales. When you told the kids that the song was being banned on a certain radio station, they wanted to hear it. So you can't tell a teenager what not to listen to, what not to do, what not to wear. So the controversy did well, for the song. And also, people like Dave Barry, when he wrote a book about the worst songs ever, he included Timothy, as did so many other people. So Timothy had the notoriety of being one of the worst songs ever recorded because of the theme.
Now, you mentioned the banning on the radio. Was that a widespread thing around the country?
Well, WABC did it, and that was telling because WABC was such a powerhouse station. Florence Greenberg and Rupert Holmes thought that, and the Buoys thought that if they would have played it, the Buoys, Timothy probably would have sold another million, maybe 1.5 million sides. But there were other stations that played it as well. But most of the stations did, and I've talked to disc jockeys around the United States, and they would go and list the stations that did play it. There were a handful that did not play it because of the content. And then what was interesting with Florence Greenberg, and I mean, she knew what side of her bread was buttered. She had 3 different versions of the song, and there was one lyric, hungry as hell, no food to eat. So she bleeped out the word hell, and she would change some of these lyrics. She would have Bill Kelly redo the lyrics. So she tried to sanitize and make the song more palatable, but WABC still wouldn't play it. And that's what she was going after because they were the big one.
Now, the Buoys would end up going on a West Coast tour. Was that their first time outside of the Northeast?
Yeah, it really was, yeah. So things took off big time, and they went out to the West Coast, and they played at the Cafe A Go-Go. And the big thing, though, was the Satsop River Fest, and that was out in outside of Seattle. But they had 150,000 people there for 4 days. It was the Pacific Northwest version of Woodstock, and they had the mud and the rain, and they had the drugs, specifically a barbiturate called Stumblers, and the kids. I mean, these are like what, 17, 18-year-old kids that are drinking wine and swallowing these barbiturates. So there were a lot of people that overdosed and passed out. So you had that horrible drug scene. You had biker gangs there. What you had, too, was the Buoys were able to open that concert on 2 consecutive days. So they were able to get notoriety from that. I was able to track down a guy named John Caldbick, and he was a photographer for the Associated Press, and he took all these wonderful photographs of the Satsop Festival. So he allowed me to use like maybe, I don't know, 10 of them in the book, and it's just great 1970s nostalgia. I mean, when things changed from the 60s, that psychedelic love, peace, no war theme, to the 70s that just got harder and edgier and really different. So the Buoys stepped into that decade, far removed from Woodstock and that psychedelia. So it was a different realm. And if we could just point out the cover of my book, if I may, it's orange and green. And when my graphic designer Danielle Crockett first presented that to me, I just thought this is like the grossest cover ever. I mean, it's garish. I mean, green and orange, that just doesn't make sense. But if you research rock posters from the 1970s, I mean, everybody was using the ugly orange and green. I don't know why, but Moody Blues and Led Zeppelin and all those bands. So that was really in keeping with the time. So I thought that the colors for Somebody Else's Dream were apropos.
So for this West Coast tour, how did that affect their career?
Well, they got the notoriety by going out there, and they had people that were helping them get these jobs in different clubs, on the West Coast and in Idaho and all that. So the more they played, the more of a fan base they got, the more people that would buy the record and buy the album. So that's how that worked. Typically for the bands, though, they make their money from being on the road and working these jobs. So the more they worked, the more money they were going to make. I don't believe that the sales from the song Timothy or the album Dinner Music, fared them well financially. Maybe it did for Scepter Records and Florence Greenberg, but not for the Buoys. But a band needs to tour. And the more they toured, the more they would go and get people to know about them.
Was the band treated fairly by Florence Greenberg?
No, not at all, no. And if you take a look at Florence's track record, and this is common knowledge, but for example, she had, her biggest act was the Shirelles, and she had a trust fund for the Shirelles. When they turned 21, they were going to get all this money. Well, they turned 21 and 22 and 23, and she's holding back. So the Shirelles had to go and sue her to get the money that was in the trust fund. Same thing for the Kingsmen that were on Scepter's sister label, Wand. The Kingsmen had to go and go to court to get the rights to their songs and the royalties that were being held back for decades. I mean, the Kingsmen were in court for a long, long time. So what happened to the Shirelles and happened to the Kingsmen, I'm sure, happened to the Buoys. I'm sure that they were a shortcut on the numbers of records that were actually sold. And to this day, we really don't know how many copies of Timothy were sold. But everybody, including Rupert Holmes, thinks that they were, the numbers were minimized.
How did rock critics respond to Timothy and the band?
That's a great question. Not good, not good. And what's interesting, if you take a look at the year 1967 and look at some of the landmark albums by the Beatles, the Stones, the Beach Boys, the Doors that came out of 1967, it was a year of extreme creativity and productivity. I mean, there may never, I don't know if there was ever a year like that, you know, in the history of rock and roll. So that was 1967, and then a couple of years later, 1971, you know, the Buoys experimented with psychedelia in their album Dinner Music, but the critics were fierce. I mean, they really wouldn't allow them to do that. I mean, they were just like beaten up in Rolling Stone and a lot of the other publications. They thought that the bass line in Timothy was pedestrian. They thought that the lyrics were grotesque, and so the critics pretty much panned. And I have this in my book. They panned Timothy as well as the Dinner Music album, which I think was unfair because there were songs there like "Give Up Your Guns" and "Tomorrow," and so a couple of the songs that the Buoys wrote that were good songs. I mean, they were nice songs. So, maybe not top 10 songs, but they deserve better than what the critics gave them. But, that happens. I mean, sometimes things go sideways, and no matter, how much you pour your heart into a project, you're going to have people on the other side that are critical.
Did the band get better coverage from the local newspapers?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Again, they were our hometown heroes. But the Buoys were resonating throughout Pennsylvania. And, they played extensively, State College, Pittsburgh, the Philly area. So they were well known in Pennsylvania and also New York State. But yeah, the rock critics, the rock journalists from back home, they just loved the Buoys and they gave them some glowing coverage. So you had that yin yang, the back home reporters versus the ones from Madison Avenue or LA,
Now you have a photo in the book of you with Hall & Oates.
Yeah.
Tell us the story behind that photo.
Yeah, let's see. That was either in Bucknell or Boulder, Colorado. I had a magazine called Timothy back in 1980, and what I was doing, I wanted to promote talent in northeastern Pennsylvania. So since Timothy was the highest charting song by any rock act, from the region, I was paying homage to that. So I had met Hall & Oates in, I believe it was Bucknell, saw him at Bloomsburg University, and then they were going out to Boulder, Colorado. So I was able to go out there and get a 45-minute interview with Hall & Oates. And it was in a room reserved for just in case. And their warm-up act was a band from Manchester, England called City Boy. And so I hung out with City Boy, had breakfast, and it was kind of neat to be on that entourage. But I had kept in touch with Hall & Oates a little bit, but that picture I wanted to include in the book because Hall & Oates, Pennsylvania guys, I mean, just like so prolific and still going strong.
Now you mentioned some of the guys who were in the band. Was there a lot of turnover among members of the band?
Yeah, there was. So right after he recorded Timothy, Bob Griesick was the bass player. He quit, so they had to recruit Jerry Ludzik. And then right after Timothy was climbing the charts, Steve Furmansky left, and he was replaced by, I believe it was Carl Syracuse. So that was the band, the group that went into Scepter to record Dinner Music. So not Griesick only played bass on Timothy. So they did that, and then after Kelly and Ludzik left the Buoys, they were replaced then by Steve Furmansky, who came back. Remember, he was an original member, and also a guy named John Buckley. And John Buckley was a guy that specialized in Bruce Springsteen songs. So what happened was when Kelly and Ludzik left, Steve Furmansky brought a Beatles sensibility to the Buoys, and John Buckley brought this Bruce Springsteen sensibility. So, the Buoys, in a sense, expanded. So they were doing what they wanted to do. They were doing cover songs, highly successful, playing bars, around the area, and in Bermuda, and all over the place, up in Canada. And Kelly and Ludzik did what they wanted to do. Their dream was to go and write their own songs and they became the Jerry Kelly Band, and then they evolved into Dakota. And again, highly successful and well connected to the Hollywood and LA elite.
Did that band, the Jerry Kelly Band, end up being more successful than the Buoys?
By more successful, how would you define that?
Well, did they have hits? Did they make more money? Did they have a bigger audience?
Yeah, I think they had a bigger audience because they had another album. Remember, the Buoys only had that Dinner Music album, and that was in 1971. So time passed on, so that became passé. Kelly and Ludwig became the Jerry Kelly Band, and then their management insisted that they change the name, and so they said that your name is going to be Dakota. So Jerry Kelly Band became Dakota. And as far as defining success, Dakota was able to do two things that were highly successful and unusual for a band. One, they were able to put together a 35-day tour with Freddie Mercury and Queen, and that was in 1980. So 35 days on the road, ending up at Madison Square Garden for 3 sold-out concerts. So they did that, and they became friends with Brian May, the lead guitar player, and also Freddie Mercury. And Freddie would just watch them on stage, and he was just really sort of enthralled that Kelly could do this night after night, although Freddie Mercury was doing the same thing. The other thing that Dakota did was they had an album on MCA that had been considered a landmark AOR album, and they did quite well with that.
Tell us about the title of the book.
Yeah, Somebody Else's Dream was a song written by Jerry Ludwig, who left the Buoys with Bill Kelly. And it was the name of the Jerry Kelly Band album. And I always thought that the dream that Ludwig and Kelly had, was sort of hijacked mainly by the corporations, by the record labels. Certainly Scepter wasn't able to go and adequately promote them and give them the promotion that they deserved and that they needed. So that was the one thing. They really didn't know what to do with this band. The other one was Polydor Records. They went to Polydor, and at the time James Brown was their biggest star. But they went to Polydor. They recorded all of these songs that I thought were album worthy, and then Polydor refused to release an album, and they had some flimsy excuse for that. And then the other one was with MCA Records when they had their Runaway album on MCA in 1980. It was a brilliant album-oriented rock album that was well respected over in Europe, but not so much in the States because there was no promotional push. But with that Runaway album, they were able to recruit a guy named Humberto Gatica. He was the engineer that had worked with Michael Jackson and all kinds of other people. They had Danny Seraphine, the drummer for Chicago, who was one of the co-producers, Hawk Woliinski with Rufus, another co-producer, and then members of Toto and Chicago helped with vocals and instrumentation. So that album was smooth, seamless. Listen to it today. It's just like, it stands the test of time, but it was Dakota's 1980 Runaway album. Just brilliant, and should have done better.
Now you talk about the Dakota sound. What was the Dakota sound?
2 and 3 layers of guitars and harmonies. Sort of maybe like Toto, like other multi-layered bands, maybe Boston or Styx. So very intricate, not just 2 or 3 chords, hard rock, but just like very intricate, almost like art rock. And again, but very, very good. Kelly and Ludwig would trade back and forth on the harmonies, on the vocals. Kelly had the higher voice, so if Jerry had a pad, Kelly would go and jump on top of that. But they worked well together. They had a good stage act. They would go shoulder to shoulder, and but Dakota was a good band, and yeah, more successful than the Buoys as far as audience, as far as album productivity, as far as associating with rock royalty. So if you want to define success like that, then yeah, they pulled that off.
So was there a point at which the Buoys just stopped touring, stopped functioning as a band?
Yeah, the last thing they did was Don't Cry Blue, and it was on Ransom Records, and Tom Fox, who was the manager of the Buoys, he was from Ransom, Pennsylvania, so they just had an independent label. They put out that song. Chris Hanlon, the drummer, was sort of just burnt out at the time, and he didn't even play on some of those sessions. He didn't play drums. They had to get another guy from a New York session drummer. So that was the last thing they did. It didn't resonate. Nobody played it. I mean, it was a nice song, but there was no backing, no corporate backing, because it was their own label. They didn't do anything with it. So that was the end. But what happened was when the Buoys stopped doing their show, Dakota pretty much stopped at the same time. So both bands took it as far as they could, and then just stopped doing it.
Now, in the book, there are various figures that kind of come and go from the story. One is Frank Zappa.
Oh, yeah,
At one point, the Buoys met him. What was that experience like for them?
Well, first of all, Frank, in case the world doesn't know this, Frank Zappa is a genius. And I talk a lot about him. First of all, the song Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple, thank you, was about Frank Zappa. And Frank Zappa was on stage in Switzerland, and there was a netting over the stage, and some idiot was drunk or stoned and threw a firebomb into the netting, and the whole thing got torched. And Frank Zappa and the band had to run off the stage, or else they were going to die. They were going to be burned. So members of Deep Purple were going to rent that stage and record the next day. So they were there. So they wrote Smoke on the Water based on what they saw with Frank Zappa. But Timothy being banned and censored, I have a chapter there talking about censorship and some of these songs, like Street Fighting Man, during the Chicago Democratic Convention, that was banned by the mayor. But Frank Zappa was not for censorship. He believed in a free society. Interesting today when you have so many, I spent 6 months in Florida, and they're big into banning books, and it's just a scary climate that people are actually banning some of these classics. But Frank Zappa was certainly against that. He was a libertarian, and he wasn't into drugs. He smoked and maybe drank a little bit of beer, but he wasn't into the drugs. But his philosophy was that if you want to use drugs, go right ahead, but don't get behind the wheel and endanger somebody's life, and don't have your drug use impact on anybody else. But if you choose to do that, go right ahead. That's your business. So that was his philosophy. Another thing when Tipper Gore tried to have the labels on the CDs, about parental approval, there were certain records that were sexual. I think Prince had a song called Nikki Baby that was about somebody masturbating. And when Tipper Gore and her daughter were listening to this Prince song, supposedly she became very irate and decided to go and censor some of these things. So they had this code, the stickers, and she debated Frank Zappa, over these labels. Now, of course, Frank didn't have a chance because the things were swinging the other way, but they did put the labels on it. But that, in its sense, sort of backfired because a lot of these kids, they would see this label with explicit content and they would buy it because maybe they wanted that. But Frank wasn't for that. And again, the book is relevant and censorship is relevant because today, what do we do when you have a lot of these news sources that are putting out information that is misinformation or misleading or has a political agenda, and what do we do? I mean, do we censor that or do we allow that in a free marketplace? And we as Americans are dealing with that topic right now. But I discuss censorship quite a bit in my book because that was relevant to the song Timothy that was banned and censored, and is symbolic of what's happening today.
Now, one of the interesting little facts that you have in the book is about Chris Hanlon, former band member. Apparently he runs a restaurant and he has a Timothy burger.
Yeah, we should go up there and get one. He's on Route 6. I think it's Chris's Barbecue. And the Buoys just recently got together. It was May 14th. They got together in Wilkes-Barre at Genetti's, and they had like 700 people there. They got together, you know, probably the last time, because all those guys are in their 70s, but Chris was there, and I had the best seat in the house. I mean, I was like as close to Bill Kelly as I am to you. And Chris was there playing his drums, but man, he's just so skillful. It was fun watching him. And then what was interesting, John Buckley was there on stage. Now that's the first time that Bill Kelly and John Buckley were on stage together, because remember, when Kelly left, Buckley replaced him, and Buckley was singing all of his songs. So that was, you know, interesting to see that.
One of the other figures that comes up, there are a lot of little people who kind of make their way through the story. Frank Virtue, who was he?
Oh yeah, Philadelphia record guy. He had a studio there, so a lot of people went to Frank, the virtual studios, and you could have a record with your own label. You could conjure up a label, and he would produce so many sides for you. He also had a shooting range there, so there was a shooting gallery there. But a lot of people, I think the Wazoos, I'm pretty sure the Wazoos are in my book, that they went to Virtual Studios to record their Inside of Me. And then another interesting tidbit, if I may, the Wazoos became a band called Great Bear. They recorded the song on Scepter Records. Now, just as in 1971, when Timothy was charting, was peaking, Scepter was folding. And what they did was Scepter put out this album by Great Bear, the song from the region, and they took them around on a little tour, like Boston and then down to Atlanta. And then at some point, they pulled back on the album. They wanted all the albums and all the promotional materials back. And to this day, the members of Great Bear don't know why exactly that was, other than they were thinking that Scepter was just falling apart and the ship was going down, the ship was sinking. So that was interesting. But again, it was a nice album. You know, it would have benefited from promotion and from airplay, but you know, it was Yank. So just another unfortunate story in the world of rock and roll.
Now, you mentioned the Wazoos, and you say in the book that they're part of an amazing musical experiment. Why?
Yeah, because, again, I talked about 1967, all of that wonderful, wonderful experimentation that was happening. I mean, anything that you wanted to do as a musician, you could. But with the Wazoos, they used an instrument that was made in Pennsylvania. And I think the Mighty Manfred, I'm trying to think the name of the band that who was using that. They were from Philadelphia, but the Wazoos got one of those and used that for just the, you know, a very unique psychedelic sound for Inside of Me. And that was on their own label that was cut at Frank Virtue Studios.
How did you end up becoming a rock journalist?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think in Freudian terms, you know, I mean, I'd much rather have been up on stage playing a Stratocaster and listening to the screaming fans and all that. But, you know, I never put in the work, so that wasn't going to happen. But there's a term called sublimation. And if I may, I'd like to answer the question in two ways. One, sublimation, if you can't do plan A, you go to plan B. And so as a young person, I would listen to, I had these composition books. I would listen to songs. I would find a song, write it down, find out who wrote it, who produced it, the label, and then try to find out what the B-side was. So I was sort of like a music geek. I mean, I just loved that intel, that information. And for some reason, I just needed to know. The other thing, too, and I think maybe more importantly, there's Japanese philosophy. And it says that if you can find the thing that brings you joy, and if that thing makes the world a better place, and if that thing brings you money, then you've found your purpose in life. So, you know, writing about, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the Coal Region and preserving that history is just something that, I mean, I feel honored to do. And the other thing I feel that if I don't do this, nobody else is gonna. Nobody else has the passion or interest or motivation to do this. So I enjoy doing this, and it's just, it's not a hardship. It's just a wonderful thing. And I'm just so thrilled, thus far at the response that somebody else's dream has been netting. It's just been a great experience, and I'm thankful and appreciative.
Do you find that people in the Northeast region still remember Timothy and the band?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm making it a point of it. Again, when I do my interviews back home, I talk about, we're celebrating the 50-year anniversary of Timothy, which was one of the most controversial songs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and also one of the highest charting songs by any rock act from northeastern Pennsylvania. So the song's important, it's symbolic. People that didn't know about it now, and yeah, it's good to be the messenger of Timothy.
Well, we've been speaking with Maxim Furek. He is the author of Somebody Else's Dream, Dakota, the Buoys, and Timothy. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this.
Enjoying this podcast? Visit PCNTV.com to find out how to support our mission. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.